Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for those who have made it through the first panel and the workshops to make it this point in our summit. This second panel is focused on community-based climate resilience. As a quick reminder before we start, we're going to be taking questions and answers from the audience for the last 10 to 15 minutes of this panel. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function so that we can bring them up and ask them to our panelists. Again, my name is Langston Alexander. I'm a Resilience Fellow for Creation Justice Ministries and a graduate student at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment, and I'll be moderating for this evening. The discussion we're going to have here will be focused on community-based climate resilience, the ways that communities and faith communities in particular can work together to resist the negative impacts of climate change. We're focusing on community level here for two primary reasons. One, we know that communities, especially low-income communities and communities of color, shoulder the brunt of the most devastating impacts of climate change. And two, communities are where we see the most action happening on climate resilience. Federal and state governments provide some technical and monetary support if communities are lucky, but most often communities are left on their own to devise cost-effective, creative solutions to this wicked problem of climate change. Currently, communities, be they towns, cities, and villages, are the unit of change when it comes to climate resilience. And central to many of those communities is faith. Faith that binds the community together socially, culturally, and physically. Faith that spurs action in the face of despair and motivates us to a higher calling. The question we will be investigating in this panel is how to translate the power of our faith and faithful communities into building holistic resilience to climate change. To help us tackle this problem, we have two distinguished guests that I'm very excited to introduce, Dr. Miyuki Hino and Reverend Michael Malcom. Dr. Hino is an assistant professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning and Environment, Ecology, and Energy program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research examines the linkages between climate hazards, governance, and public policy to drive effective and equitable adaptation to climate change. Her recent work has focused on measuring the societal impacts of sea level rise, the effects of flood risk on property markets, and the use of managed retreat in adapting to climate change. Miyuki received a PhD in Environment and Resources from Stanford University and a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Yale University. The Reverend Michael Malcom is the Executive Director of Alabama Interfaith Power and Light and a licensed and ordained United Church of Christ minister. He is the former senior pastor of Rush Memorial Congregational UCC in Atlanta, Georgia, and the founder of the People's Justice Council, a 501c3 nonprofit focusing on environmental justice. Reverend Malcom serves as the Environmental Justice Minister for the Southeast Conference of the United Church of Christ. He's the co-chair of the Building Power from the Grassroots Action Team with the U.S. Climate Action Network, co-facilitator for the International Solidarity Working Group with the National Black Environmental Justice Network, co-chair of the Climate Impacts Working Group with The Kitchen, and a board member of the Southeast Climate and Energy Network. He received his undergraduate degree from Beulah Heights University in Biblical Education and Leadership, and his Master of Divinity degree from the Interdenominational Theological Center in 2011. He received his MBA from the Terry School of Business at the University of Georgia in 2016. So with the introductions done, we're going to jump right into this conversation. I think a good way to start off is with Dr. Hino. If you could just give us a broader understanding of what climate impacts are going to look like in the U.S. Between now and the next 2050 and 2100, kind of what we can expect to see going forward from here, what we're sure about, and what maybe there's uncertainty about as well.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm very happy to be here. It's an honor to be joining all of you and joining this panel. I'm happy to kind of set the scene a little bit with what we know, what we've seen so far, and what we know is coming in the future. We know, of course, that it's going to get warmer. And in particular, what we've seen already is a really noticeable increase in warm nights where it doesn't get below 75 degrees, 80 degrees. And while it's not as hot as it gets during the day, the nights are really critical for your body's time to recover from the heat of the day. And so those warm nights are particularly dangerous for health risks associated with heat waves. Heat waves also make air pollution worse. And so there are really significant health concerns there. As we've seen, I think all around the US in the past couple of months, we're going to get more rain more often. And so when it rains, we get more of it than we used to. And those extreme rain events are more extreme, dumping more and more water than they have before. And that's especially true in the Northeast and the Southeast US in terms of what we've seen so far. We know as well that fire risks are evolving and growing really quickly. When it gets hot, all that vegetation dries out, right? So whatever that spark is, whether it's lightning or a power line, the fire grows and expands much more quickly than we've seen historically. And the last one I should not forget to mention is sea level rise. I think a good way of thinking about sea level rise is, so in the past 100 years, since 1920, in the US, we've generally seen about a foot of sea level rise. In some places, it's more like 10 inches. In some cases, it's a little more. That's about what we're going to see in the next 30 years between now and 2050. And so all the problems that we're starting to see with flooding happening more often, with hurricanes, right, they're starting at a higher point than they were before, so that storm surge can go farther inland than it could before. All of that is going to escalate really quickly moving forward. So it's going to look a little bit different wherever you live, right? Some places are going to be more concerned about heat, some more about rain. In some places, there's a lot of concerns going on all at the same time. And I think, when it's hard to consume all of this information and not kind of get into this negative spiral about all of these changes and risks. But it's important to remember that the fact that we know these changes are coming, that's an advantage, right? That means that we can prepare, that we don't have to be sitting ducks for when these changes are taking place, but we can actually engage with it and prepare for what's ahead of us.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hino. I mean, it's a great reminder, that we have an advantage. Like this is not a foregone conclusion, despite how dire some of these, changes could be. Reverend Malcom, to talk sort of more regionally, talk about, where you work in Alabama and the Gulf Coast, what have you seen there? What have communities you worked with seen there already in changes, or what have they not seen yet? And what are they looking kind of forward to the future to help mitigate, to help, strengthen themselves again?
Doc, I appreciate you for setting the tone. And as you were speaking, all I could do was say, this is happening now. For those in the Gulf Coast, this is happening now. For communities that look like me and communities that look like you and other communities that are of low wealth, and this is actually happening to them now. Because of industrial pollution, we have heat islands where people don't get a break from heat, where you have elderly people that are cramped in houses that because they're leaky houses are now losing their AC, and so they sit in the house and suffer, while their bills are astronomically high because the utility company is taking advantage of our elders and our single Black mothers. I mean, that's the our data proves that. Data also proves that because of the trees being taken, deforestation that's happening in the Gulf Coast, we have a whole lot less flood mitigation. And so our communities are flooding now. It's not happening later. because of the Gulf being warm enough to catch on fire. We saw video of the Gulf catching on fire. We caught the Gulf on fire. Let me stop for a second and pause right there. There is something inherently wrong with a society that has caught water on fire and moved on as if though it didn't matter. There's nothing natural about catching water on fire. That should really alarm us. But because of the water catching on fire, it's eroding our landmass, and we're getting sea level rise. And those who live on the coast, such as those in the Gullah Geechee Islands, are losing their homes and losing their culture as a result. So this is happening now. This isn't happening later. So what we did as the People's Justice Council, we said, hey, we want to be the change that we want to see. And so we partnered with Creation Justice Ministries. We partnered with some other partners along the Gulf Coast, such as Texas Impact, such as Mississippi Rising Coalition, such as Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, and some others, to start building out resilience and restoration hubs throughout the Gulf Coast so that we can use communities of faith and households of faith to be that respite for our communities and that resource for our communities to help to alleviate when disaster comes. But not just when disaster comes, we don't want to leave it there. We want the full cycle. So we want to meet them at the point of disaster, help them to recover from disaster, and then look at what it looks like to thrive thereafter. However, in the same time, we want to see if we can mitigate the disaster from happening in the first place by having our resiliency hubs to not only be hubs of practical solutions, but also have some advocacy coming so we can see policy change that's more equitable and more just for those who are now vulnerable, who suffer. So that is the long way, Langston, of answering your question. I hope that I was able to answer it fully the way that you asked me.
That was wonderful. I mean, I think it really captured that, you know, this is not a single problem, right? There are many aspects of this problem. And, you know, it's responding to disaster, but it's also trying to stop the disasters from happening, to lessen, you know, to do all these different aspects. It takes a lot. It's not a single solution. And I think in that vein, Dr. Hino, you've also done a lot of work with communities. I know in North Carolina around flooding. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you've done there and sort of the strategies and the processes that they've used to incorporate climate change into their planning for the future? Kind of what some of those technical, but also maybe some of those non-technical things that communities can do to prepare.
Sure, absolutely. I think there are so many different parts of this challenge, and adaptation and building climate resilience, it's a process. It's not a place that you get to, right? It's not something that you do and then you're done and you're adapted and you're good to go. It's something that is constantly evolving. And I think what I've seen is that in that journey, in that process, each community that I've engaged with is at a different place in that journey. And so for some of them, they're trying to collect information and they're trying to assess the state of the problem, figure out exactly what's at most risk, who are the people, what are the places that are most of concern today and moving forward. In other places, they've spent a lot of time collecting information. Now they're trying to get community input on developing potential responses, right? So they're saying, well, we could maybe try to restore a wetland here. We could try to work on an infrastructure solution over here. And what might that look like? What's the fit for us, right? For what we need and so forth. I think we see over and over again that having processes that engage with people who know their community best, is incredibly important because there's no one size fits all solution, right? We do need to learn from each other because lots of communities are facing similar challenges, but the answer is very likely to be different from place to place. And so having these strong community networks and places and venues where people can discuss and what would be the right solution for us is incredibly important to helping move that process forward and continue on that journey of building climate resilience.
Yeah, and on that note of, community engagement, what is the role that faith communities play in that? How can they be a part of that engagement? That give and take with policymakers, with scientists. What do you all see as the faith community's role in building that back and forth? And we'll start with you, Reverend.
So two books come to mind, and actually these are two of my mentors who I consider dear to me. Reverend Jim Antal wrote a book. I want to say it was, I can't remember the name of it. Oh my goodness. Climate Church, Climate World. Climate Church, Climate World. And then there was Shalonda Baker, who wrote a book, Revolutionary Power. And in both books, they painted scenarios of us doing nothing and what it would look like to explain to a generation what our inaction caused. I look at it, I look at both of those, and I wanted to look at a view that was opposite. What would it look like for congregations to get involved? Not in so much feeling like we want to fight for the climate. I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to say put us in that category, because there's some that may say, climate change isn't real, and that's well and fine. But we do know people suffer. We do know that the planet is suffering. We do know that, and I believe that we as communities of faith are called to care. So what would it look like for us to recenter caring for our communities in this time of crisis, when we know that people are suffering from industrial pollution? At this time of crisis, when we know that people are losing land and losing culture and losing homes to sea level rise. At this time of crisis, when we know that people are losing their livelihoods to their utilities, what would it look like for us as communities of faith to center care? And so in doing so, I believe that is our obligation. It is our obligation to get involved. It is our obligation to care for society, to care for culture. It is our obligation to care for creation. And so that's what we can do. That's how we can get involved. What does that look like for your community? I'm glad you asked. You tend to ask all the right questions this evening. It looks like whatever your community needs. There was a question that was in the chat that asked about Black churches and how they've responded. Can I tell you that Black communities have been coming up with solution after solution after solution? And the reason why is because, hell, we have to. We have no choice. We have no choice because we sit in the pollution. We deal with the flooding. We have to deal with the high utilities. And we figured out ways to survive. It would look like the congregations getting involved with fighting against climate by helping these communities to scale up the solutions that already exist. Our indigenous family has been fighting for creation and telling us how to fight for creation since we've been here. It would look like us listening and amplifying their voices and validating who they are. and their concerns and saying, you sure know a whole hell of a lot better than we do about what's going on, because we messed this up pretty bad. So it would look like us humbling ourselves and really centering, caring for our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend. And Dr. Hino, have you seen kind of the community engagement? Have you seen kind of faith communities be involved in some of these local efforts, or maybe, you know, you've seen success where they have been listened to, they have been brought in effectively to do some of this work?
Well, I don't think I could have said it better than Reverend Malcom. That was fantastic, and I think conversations like this are an example of progress. All of the people who are here, who are taking action in their own communities, who are amplifying the work of others in their communities who are pushing this forward, that is what this looks like. You said at the beginning that communities right now, communities is where the action is, right? That's where the progress is being made. And I think in every step of the way, right? It doesn't have to be big headline grabbing accomplishments. It can be small wins, but small wins are still absolutely how progress is being made.
Thank you. I want to transition a little bit here. Again, a lot of the conversations I hear are around sort of physical resilience, right? You know, how do we make ourselves stronger, you know, physically from the world? But I think that leaves out some of the other aspects of being resilient to climate change, and being resilient in general. It includes, you know, our mental and cultural, these spiritual aspects of resilience that are just as important. I think an example of this that shows it really well are conversations I've seen about managed retreat or community relocation, right? For like sea level rise here in North Carolina, like what happens when, you know, communities are threatened to the point where they might have to move. And those conversations get very contentious very quick, because people are tied not just physically to the land, but spiritually and socially and culturally. So how do we change? I think a lot of our systems are built around this physical safety, but not around the spiritual and cultural safety. So how do we shift our mindset to be able to start to pick some of that up in our policy and our actions? And maybe what do faith communities of different stripes, kind of, what role do they play in that? Why don't we go back to Dr. Hino again?
Sure. I think one question I get often is, you know, where should I live in a changing climate? What's going to be the safe place? Is it somewhere in Montana? Is it somewhere in New York? You know, what's going to be the safe place? And I think what we overlook when we ask those questions, and typically how I respond is, everywhere is going to face some threat. So the safe place to live is the place where the community is engaged, the community is willing and wants to collectively act for each other, where neighbors are checking on neighbors. We've known for a very long time that is one of the most influential things to protecting ourselves from dangerous events is, do you have someone you can go to get help? Are resources being shared across a community? Those are the places, right? These are not aspects of the physical system or aspects of the climate even, but the strength of the social ties, the commitment to each other in the community. We know, we've seen time and time again that really, really matters in protecting from events becoming disasters and recovering fully and quickly from those types of events. So I do think that we sometimes focus too much on how tall is the seawall and how hot is it going to be. but focusing on each other and investing in those social ties is one of the things that we know, like I said, from many people have done lots of complicated research to show that this really does make a difference.
And Reverend Malcom, you have a take on that? How faith communities play a part in that shift in mindset?
I think Dr. Hino knocked that one out of the park. I wish I could come back and add on to it, but I don't think I can. I'll just re-emphasize the fact again of us shifting our focus from caring for climate to caring for community. I've often said, if you help the people, you'll heal the planet. We've seen that happen. We saw it happen when the pandemic first jumped off and everybody was on lockdown, and we saw smog start going away, and we saw a lot of the pollutions and emissions die down because nobody was able to move about and enjoy their creature comforts and their conveniences the way that they used to. But now that we've gotten back going again, now we're seeing it once again rise. And so it should tell us that our lack for care for one another, our addiction to our conveniences are actually killing us. We tend to think that we can somehow, we've got this bubble around us and we can afford to escape. But the fact of the matter is, the wind blows and the water flows. It may not affect you directly, but indirectly it affects us all. All of us are suffering from this crisis. And it's amazing to me that we tend to see it in different aspects or different lights. I have yet with my rational mind to understand that irrational thought. I can't see how, and I'm taking a long way around to get to this answer, and I apologize, but I'm a preacher and that's what we do. I can't see how we have forgotten or we don't see that our comforts are what's driving this, and the emissions that or the pollution that our communities feel are the emissions that our planet is feeling. And we can't not see the other person. And so the question, or Dr. Hino said she's been asked, where can you live? I would say you live where you see your neighbor. You live where you see your neighbor. And if you can't see your neighbor, then you have to question yourself, where do you really live? And that's more mental and spiritual than it is physical. What is it about me? What's prohibiting me from seeing that Black community that I rode past to get to my white community? Or what's prohibiting me from seeing that brown community that I rode past to get to my affluent church? And that ain't talking about just Black and white. That's talking about anybody with resources that ignore those that don't have it to fight. We fight it to not go in our backyards, but it lands in somebody else's. And then we shut our eyes. So where do I live when it all falls apart? I live where I see my community. I live where I see my people. I live where I see my neighbor. And that should be for everybody.
I mean, I feel like I've heard this, and I heard this in the last panel. I'm hearing it here, right? The way that we silo these issues, right? But the way that they're all connected to each other, right? The how we, treat each other, how we culturally live our lives, kind of how we separate each other is not separated from climate change, right? They're not these separate things that we can ignore one or the other. There needs to be this holistic change. And I think that leads us into, we're living through a moment of upheaval in many ways. How do we use that to transition to a more just and equitable world? I think about this a lot. I mean, it seems like there's it is so dire, but there's so much opportunity. How do we grab a hold of that? And while people are paying attention, while people are worried, how do we bring them in and make change actually happen? We'll go back to you, Reverend Malcom.
Sorry. I wish you would have asked me that one last, to be honest. In fact, can you shift it to Dr. Hino and I'll go after?
Yeah,
Dr.
absolutely.
Yeah,
No problem.
I appreciate that. I just feel led that way. Forgive me.
Sure. Well, I'm as a researcher in an academic institution, I feel like I'm not the person to ask how to make change happen. But I'll tell you how I think about it. It comes back a little bit to what we touched on earlier, which is that it is about small wins consistently over time. And it's not easy to be constantly confronted with bad news and with a lot of really threatening things and information all the time. But for me, I think seeing small wins and seeing people trying to change things in their community, whether it's a pocket park in a neighborhood that wasn't there before, or in my case, having a student who didn't really think they cared about climate change, who then walks out of my class and says, "Oh, I think I might try to find a job working on this." Like, I don't think that I'm not, sitting here waiting for some big, massive change to hit and say that things are going to be solved. But I do think that if we look for them, there are little bright spots that we can find, and it will be more and more of those little bright spots that are going to cumulatively lead to positive change.
I tend to be rather long-winded at times, and so I wanted to give time so I can make this point. When the children of Israel were getting ready to go into the promised land and they had to cross the Jordan, God gave them instruction according to scripture. And it says that the priests were to go in front, and before them were to go the harp players, and the instrument or the praise team was to go in front of them, and then the preacher was supposed to go. And I say that to say, in order for us to get to that next place where we need to be, it's going to take those people of faith getting out front and leading the way. We have a specific message that goes beyond the political message. I can care less if you're a Democrat or a Republican. I could even care less how much money you got in your pocket. What I do care about is, how do you care for your neighbor? That's my only concern. My only concern is us living in a truth that loves and does justice and loves mercy and walks humbly before God. That's my only concern and my only message, because that's my only call. And so I don't have to have political conversation. I could cut across that. How are the policies that you're making caring for community? How are the policies that you're making caring for the cosmos? That's a specific message, because that's a specific call that we have. We don't exercise it enough, y'all. We should be the barometers for society and the thermometers, but we only operate as thermostats. We just tell the temperature. Oh, it's awfully bad out there. It's a mess out there. There's injustice out there. Oh, Black folk getting done bad. Our indigenous brothers and sisters getting done bad. We need to stand in the streets and pump our fists, because no. We are salt and light. We shift the course of society. Our involvement brings about impact. It changes things, it shifts things. And so we've got to stand out front. And the scripture says, when the priests put their foot in the Jordan, it backed up so everybody could cross. It's when we get involved and we make it happen, is when everybody will feel the effects or the benefits of our actions, but it won't happen unless we get involved. Everybody can't be in the streets. I understand that. But all of us are called to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before our God. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend. I think I remember the first time I saw you, you were coming back from somewhere and you said you were getting into some good trouble. And I remember being moved by that. So I appreciate it. I think my last question, is a simple one. It's personal to y'all. I just, both of you do what can be kind of heavy and difficult work at times. And what gives you hope? What, gives you light and allows you to keep going, to keep doing that work. I think it's not always easy, as Dr. Hino said, when we're bombarded with this kind of dread and gloom all the time. But we all, if we're going to keep going, we need to find that light and that hope. So, I'm interested what keeps you moving, what keeps you interested, what keeps you engaged, all those things. Dr. Hino, if you have one, do you want to go first?
Some days it's hard, but a lot of days, and I think over time, I think it's getting easier. And I think that's because what makes me optimistic and what gives me hope is, these small, like we've been talking about the whole time, these small wins. So instances when someone in a town in coastal North Carolina says, do you know anything about this or this? Can you help me find an answer to something? And sometimes I can help, sometimes I can't. But the fact that there are these little opportunities to feel like people are engaging, people are making change in the world. And there are these little opportunities for me to help them and for me to push things forward little by little. I think it's getting easier because I can see more and more people working on this, and I can see more and more progress happening. And I think there's no other way than to focus on what we can do. And the fact that people are acting, that people care, people are listening, that makes a really big difference, and that gives me hope.
Tequila, Langston. Listen, some days you the bug, some days you the windshield. I wish I could see Avery right now. Either he's crying, laughing, or he got his fist balled up because he's extra intense. No, seriously, what gives me hope? I believe in laughter, y'all. And that youthful energy of our young people, man, I'm telling you, that if there's nothing else to fight for, it's the youth. They got it right. If you listen, they got it right. They cut through the chase, either it's right or wrong. And I love that. So I enjoy pouring into the youth, and that gives me hope. And again, laughing, being able to enjoy life. It's hard enough dealing with what we deal with. It's hard enough dealing with what you deal with just as a person of faith. Laugh a little, enjoy life.
Well, that's a wonderful reminder. Just to find that joy. We'll take a couple questions from the audience. We have a few that are in. If anyone else has one, feel free to put it in the Q&A chat as we're going through these first couple. We'll try to get to as many as we can here before we have to move on. I think this one's going to be mostly for Reverend Malcom. Have you seen ways to get congregations politically active? You know, like what can people do? I think people are wondering, you know, maybe they aren't seeing the kind of action they want out of their faith community, out of their congregation. I don't know if you've seen, I mean, it's obviously specific to where you are and to what your community is doing already, but if you have some words on that.
Yeah, I want to answer that two ways. First and foremost, first thing I want to say is every congregation is different. So you may have in mind that you want your congregation to jump out in the streets and start knocking on doors and getting other people involved, and that may just not be who the characteristic of your the makeup of your congregation is, and we have to accept that. I was taught this by Reverend Juan Smith, but every congregation does different things, but they are experts in what they do. So your congregation may be dope letter writers, and they can put together a letter that moves mountains. Why make them get out in the street where you need somebody to write a letter to get the attention of legislators? Your congregation may not be able to write letters or get out in the street, but they might be able to raise some money like you wouldn't believe. Why not use your congregation to support some of these community organizations that's doing the work out here? Again, solutions exist. You just got to scale them up. Our issue is everybody ignores our solutions because they think they got it right, and they continue to mess it up. The second thing that I want to say in that question is not just everybody can do something different, but remind the people that there are people that's hurting and speak to the hurt. Start with that. I don't, if you've listened today, I did bring in emissions, but I only brought in emissions to make the point of connecting it to the healing of people and healing the planet. But I start with what the people heard. I don't talk about emissions, I talk about pollution. I don't talk about sea level rise, I talk about flooding. That's what they identify with. They know what's happening. They might not be able to say it in our language because of colonialism and supremacy that has taken language and moved it outside of the folks that need it so they can disconnect the resources from them. But nevertheless, they know what they're going through. And again, there are solutions that they've come up with because they've had to. They've had to. It's time to fix them having to. How do we do that? You do it in different ways. Your congregation does it according to what your congregation is made up to do. And again, shout out to Reverend Juan Smith. This is the third time I used that. So I told her I'd give her credit 3 times. And then after that, it's mine.
Yeah, we've been getting a lot of good resources, and we'll compile a lot of these resources and send them out to all the people listening, all the participants, so that they have some of these collected, some of the books and the people that they could connect to potentially. But it's a great point. I mean, we all have different tools. I've heard people talk about it as tools in a toolbox, right? Not one tool is better for another. It's just use it for different things at different times. So I think we have time for maybe one more. This is sort of a high level question, but it's asking about the difference. This person was saying they hearing resilience and restoration and climate adaptation. They're hearing all these different words, and they're wondering what sort of the meanings of them are and what the difference is. Dr. Hino, I wonder if you would talk for a minute, just how you think these words are useful or not useful to us. I have also heard, I mean, there's official definitions to resilience, but people use resilience in lots of different ways. You know, climate adaptation, maybe more technical term. How useful are these terms, and sort of what place do they have in kind of making things clearer or making things less clear for people?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think there's certainly lots of situations where we have more words and we gain nothing from having more words for similar things. I think of for the most part, think of resilience and adaptation as the same things. I think one of the distinctions that adaptation kind of brings in, at least conceptually, is the idea that there's something new and you're adapting to it. And so that angle of the climate is changing and therefore there's something to adapt to is, I think, maybe the nuance there between adaptation and resilience. But ultimately, I think resilience in all of its forms is adaptation no matter what. So there's limits to that term being useful. I think we also know that natural systems, especially wetlands, forests, mangroves, barrier islands, in their natural state, they are very resilient ecosystems. And so when we talk about restoration, those things I think are really intimately tied. When we restore those systems to the way they were before we interfered, they become more resilient. And so, and they help us become more resilient. So I think there's maybe some angles of resilience that are in addition to restoration, but I think they're all very closely connected.
And to you, Reverend Malcom, you know, you started a program called From Resilience to Restoration, and I was wondering sort of what that means to you, why you titled this program that, kind of how that came about, and what those words mean in your context.
Yeah, again, for us, and I actually sent Cal a message in the chat. If you can hear me, Cal, if you would just drop that one page or the link to it for me. But for us, Resilience to Restoration, the reason we started this program again is because we saw the need for us to speak into communities. But I do want to say that the Resilience to Restoration is not just a practical measure, it's also looking at it holistically. And it's looking at the resilience of mind, resilience of spirit, resilience of social structures, as well as resilience of those tangible structures such as home and land loss and things of that nature. And so we looked at resilience as being able to withstand during times of disaster, or during times of, again, even looking at industrial pollution, doing weatherization helps people to be able to be resilient in their homes because it makes it healthier. But we also looked at restoration as being a form of thriving, coming out of it. And basically your restoration is your fight back or your bounce back. Your resilience is your fight. Your restoration is your bounce back. And we want to help people to come up with plans on how to bounce back as well. So how do we rebuild and build better? I hope that answered the question and was succinct enough.
As always, it answers it and more. So no need to apologize. I think with that, we're at the end of our time. Thank you so much, Dr. Hino, Reverend Malcom. This has been a wonderful conversation.